The U.S. Supreme Court just moved up the deadline on one of the Pennsylvania election lawsuits. Hi, welcome to another episode of Legal Briefs. I'm Wes Austin. I'm a lawyer, comedian, trying to keep you updated on the latest legal news. So, Supreme Court Justice Alito has ordered the state of Pennsylvania to respond one day earlier than they were originally scheduled. Does that mean we're going to hear from the U.S. Supreme Court on this? Maybe. Wait until the end and I will tell you what I think. First, let's make sure we know which lawsuit we are talking about. This is the one filed by Mike Kelly, a congressman in Pennsylvania, along with Sean Parnell and a number of other individuals against the state of Pennsylvania. So this lawsuit had to do with Act 77 in Pennsylvania, which was the no excuse mail-in ballots. And the plaintiffs were arguing that this was unconstitutional under the Pennsylvania Constitution. And the remedy they were seeking was they wanted all of these ballots, the mail-in ballots, tossed because that was unconstitutional. You might recall at the district court, this is where the judge, I think Judge McCullough, actually issued an order halting any further certification from Pennsylvania. She thought that there might be something here, we need to look at this. That was quickly appealed to the Pennsylvania Supreme Court, and the Pennsylvania Supreme Court reversed the lower court judge and said, hey, Mike Kelly and the rest of you plaintiffs, you waited too long. Because of the doctrine of latches, you had to bring this sooner. You waited almost a year, therefore you lose. All right? And that is what the Pennsylvania Supreme Court ruled on. They didn't actually comment on whether it was constitutional or unconstitutional. All they said was, you waited too long. And another thing to note, this was an issue with the Pennsylvania Constitution. So they were arguing that Act 77 was unconstitutional under the Pennsylvania Constitution, not the federal Constitution. So keep that in mind. So after they lost at the Pennsylvania Supreme Court, the plaintiffs filed at the United States Supreme Court. And here's what they filed. An emergency application for writ of injunction and also a petition for writ of certiorari. So basically, they wanted an emergency injunction and they wanted the Supreme Court to agree to hear the case. So what is the safe harbor deadline? The safe harbor deadline is December 8th, and that means that any disputes about the electoral votes need to be resolved by December 8th. Well, the U.S. Supreme Court had scheduled the deadline for the state of Pennsylvania to respond the day after this deadline, which didn't look great. There's some arguments out there as to maybe it didn't really matter. The Supreme Court still could have done something under some arguments, but it still creates some issues and didn't look great. Then, just yesterday, Justice Alito moved that deadline from December 9th to the morning of December 8th. I think it's at 9 a.m. So he changed the deadline so that the state of Pennsylvania had to respond by the morning 9 a.m. of this safe harbor deadline, which means the Supreme Court could act on that deadline date if they wanted to. So what do I think is going to happen? Will the U.S. Supreme Court rule on this case? I probably would not hold my breath on it, and just let me tell you why I think that. First, the Pennsylvania Supreme Court ruled on this based on the doctrine of latches, them saying, hey, you guys waited too long. That's why we're going to dismiss this with prejudice and you can't bring it again, based on latches. So that issue, I'm not sure the U.S. Supreme Court is going to want to be taking it because that's really what this is based on. The Pennsylvania Supreme Court didn't rule on this based on the Pennsylvania constitutional question. So they didn't even speak to that. But that was really the one constitutional question, was the Pennsylvania Constitution. So that's another reason why I don't think the U.S. Supreme Court will probably take this, because that's a state law issue, the Pennsylvania Constitution. The Pennsylvania Supreme Court, they are going to be the ultimate authority on that, not the U.S. Supreme Court. Now, if something's truly was a federal question, was it unconstitutional based on the U.S. Constitution? Then yes, I think the Supreme Court, that's something much more likely that they would take and grant review. But keep in mind, you have to have at least 4 justices before they're going to grant review of something. And so far, it looks like Justice Alito wants to do it. I don't know who else wants to do it, but I still haven't seen that this writ of certiorari has been granted. And so I think he may have just moved that date just in case he can get someone else to review it, that they don't have that issue. Or he could have moved the date just because it kind of looked bad that they had the deadline after the safe harbor date, which almost, I mean, people could say, like, well, were you not even going to look at it anyway? Is that why you had it after the deadline? Come on. And so maybe they just changed it so that it looked better. All right, thank you for watching, and tune back soon. I will keep you posted.